So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We enjoy your presence and we thank you for coming back to the second half of our conference for today. For this third panel, we are going to talk about the economic networking challenges and mechanism, where we start with in the morning with an envisage of what the Indo-Pacific region actually means, and then continue to second panel where we talk about the security networking, where during the second panel we actually hint about the importance of economic networking as well. So this kindly lead us to this particular panel, the first panel in the afternoon, but the third panel of this conference. And it is a true delight that we have Mr. Akiyama to act as our moderator. Mr. Akiyama now is the president of the Akiyama Association from Japan, and now without further ado, Mr. Akiyama, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The panel 3's title is Economic Networking Challenges and Mechanisms. But of course, it's related to the free and open Indo-Pacific region. As Congresswoman of Japan, Rui Matsukawa, referred to this morning, that the Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, had remarks in Nairobi in Africa 2 years ago, this free and open Indo-Pacific project. At that time, he bear in mind the development of Africa, and also realizing or showing the importance of the connectivity or relationships between two continents. It means that, Africa and Eurasia, or Africa and Asia, by maintaining the connectivity or relationships between two continents, by keeping free and open Indo-Pacific Ocean. The step down of the United States from TPP 2 years ago gave a shock to the region, to states located in this region. It was interesting that President of the United States, Donald Trump, made clear the importance of the free and open Indo-Pacific region very clearly, maybe in Vietnam, which was endorsed by Secretary of State Pompeo's announcement on the concrete initiatives, particularly on the infrastructure investment in this region this year. Personally speaking, I have been deeply involved in the bilateral dialogues between Japan and Taiwan for the more than 15 years. Every year, maybe I have been here. But it is a great honor for me to join this international conference like this. I mean that this is a multilateral conference. Sometimes, a trilateral dialogue, or a quadrilateral, or a 5 countries dialogue this year. I think it is very important or meaningful that Taiwan Taiwan authorities organizes this multilateral conference, different from bilateral one, to discuss this this free and open Indo-Pacific region. This panel focuses on economic networking challenges and mechanisms. I mean that economic aspect related to the free and open Indo-Pacific region. It's very important to discuss economic aspect, although, of course, the economy and politics are mutually interrelated or interacted. But anyway, there are many key words related to economy aspect, related to this concept, freedom, democracy, market-oriented economy, human rights protection, environment, sustainability. So we have already learned a lot this morning and, at a lunchtime speech. We have 3 speakers, presenters in this panel 3. Mr. Manpreet Singh Anand, the Senior Vice President, Albright Stonebridge Group, USA, at my left side. And Professor Akihiko Tamura, your side, right side. Professor, National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, Japan. And Christy Xu Zunzi. She is now Director Taiwan ASEAN Studies Centers, Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research, Taiwan. I think Mr. Anand or Mr. Tamura, maybe Ms. Xu, were deeply engaged in the government activities, administration. So I think they will provide very interesting, speeches in these panels. And I would like 3 speakers to have speeches of 15 minutes. And for discussant, Mr. Habe Lemanu, and also Ms. Lenny Mullen, to have 10 minutes, comment and question, because of our having a very limited time. But I would like to, 3 speakers to speak. How can I say? Not fast, not necessary to say slowly, but so that, high school students can understand well. The first speaker, Mr. Anand, please. Okay.
Well, thank you, Chair. And I want to express my real gratitude to the Prospect Foundation, to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and of course, to the Center for New American Security for putting on this important dialogue and for inviting me here. It's my first time to Taiwan, and I've really enjoyed my time here thus far. And if nothing else, if the dialogue doesn't beckon me back, surely the food will at some point. I wanted to make three broad points in this session. As the chair noted, the session it talks about economic networks, challenges, and mechanisms, and I thought I would make three broad points along those lines. And the first point is really around why economic engagement and networking across the Indo-Pacific matters. Why is this important? Beyond a strategic sense, but why is this important from a development imperative? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The second broad point that I want to make is really around recent statements that the US administration has made around the Indo-Pacific. What's, in my mind, important about those statements, but also a key challenge that I think we need to put front and center on the table in relation to the Trump administration's rhetoric versus actions in this space. And the third point, to really focus in on perhaps some specific measures, some specific mechanisms, if you will, that I would recommend to really deepen economic engagement across the region. So first, on the importance of economic engagement in the first place, you know, my old boss, Secretary Kerry, used to say that foreign policy is economic policy, and economic policy is foreign policy. And if we view that notion through the context of globalization, we see that smart trade policy with a focus on connectivity is what empowers us to defend strategic interests around the world. Those strategic interests that are shared by like-minded partners and allies like Taiwan and Japan and India and the United States. And this is not just because of the old adage that if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. It's also because our trade and economic ties around the world enables us to promote essential economic reforms, to build international norms in accordance with democratic values, and to foster cooperation among nations to address many of the shared global challenges that we face today. And so I would submit that the pursuit of a free and open Indo-Pacific can be seen as another manifestation of globalization, of how the freer flow of trade and people and capital are so important for many of these like-minded nations. And we do know from a development perspective that the effects of globalization have actually been overwhelmingly positive, especially for the poor. Since the 1990s, 1 billion people have escaped extreme poverty. Chronic hunger and infant mortality have halved. In 1980, only about half of the children in the developing world finished primary school. Today, it's 4 out of 5. And the progress is actually accelerating. It took over 30 years from the mid-1970s to the mid-2000s for the global middle class to rise from 1 billion to 2 billion. It's only taken 10 years to grow to 3 billion today, and we could surpass 4 billion by 2021, just 3 years from now. So in essence, promoting economic connectivity and growth is not for growth's sake, but rather to encourage development. And I think we all need to be mindful of that being an overarching goal of what we're trying to do here, beyond just the strategic goals. However, today we are seeing voices across the globe calling for a retrenchment of globalization. for closing borders, for rising protectionism. And the fact is, this would hurt all consumers, and it would likely hurt the poor the most. And so it's important for us to remind ourselves what is actually important here. And I'd like to focus in on the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific. As Admiral Stavridis also mentioned this morning, you know, our economy thrives because of global trade. And most global trade actually happens on the seas. 90% of the world's trade by weight and volume travels over the oceans. And the Indian Ocean in particular is the most critical crossroads of global maritime trade. Half of the world's container traffic and 2/3 of the seaborne oil trade transit the Indian Ocean. And that's while about 30% of global trade is handled by Indian Ocean ports. So you can plainly see that even as you think about or talk about security across the Indian Ocean, it's actually inextricably linked to the stability of the global economy. And because economic prosperity underpins military strength for all of our nations, the ability of those Indian Ocean region countries to be regional security providers will depend on their continued growth, which will come in large part from greater regional economic connectivity. For South Asia in particular, there is tremendous potential. The region boasts more working age people than anywhere else in the world. Its economies are growing at an average of 7%. Over 250 million South Asians will move into cities in the next 15 years, which will create strong demand for infrastructure and services. In fact, the World Bank estimates that the region will need about $2.5 trillion in infrastructure investment over the next several years to really meet its economic potential. So these are all indicators of why all of us should be thinking about a strategic focus towards the Indo-Pacific in much larger terms. Now, early in the Trump administration's tenure, it described how the U.S. Strategic and economic interest in the Indo-Pacific are absolutely linked to India. And at first you may think, well, it might be too much to ask India, which is a country that liberalizes its economy in fits and starts, to become now a global champion of free trade and open borders. But there's no doubt that there's a strong constituency to see India fully shed its non-aligned roots, to become a beacon of democratic values, to affirm itself as an anchor in the Indo-Pacific to defend international norms, and to continue its trajectory as the fastest growing large economy. And it's in that context that I think India has been rightly featured by the Trump administration as a part and a big focus of its Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, many speakers today have talked about comments recently made by Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Ross just last month when they spoke at an event focused on the Indo-Pacific, in which they rolled out their views on how the administration would focus its efforts in this area. And I think importantly, we should remember some of the comments they made. Secretary Pompeo talked about the U.S. seeking partnership, not domination in the region, how the U.S. believes in strategic partnerships. And in that context, the Secretary gave credence to needing a rules-based order to really drive economic relations. Though I think we have to also note that President Trump seems to view many of the relations in the region as zero-sum games that are defined largely by the trade balance that the U.S. might have with these countries, which frankly gives pause to a lot of longstanding partners and allies. This is not just true in this region. We've seen, even just in the last few days, longtime allies like France and Germany now starting to have open conversations about building their own defense architectures or starting a new SWIFT financial system that isn't backed by the US. And so many wonder whether the Indo-Pacific strategy is fully embraced by the president himself, and what the reaction will be from Indo-Pacific partners, given these dynamics. Secretary Ross engaged in a conversation about the administration's view on trade. He commented that withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership did not mean withdrawal from the region. But when pressed about what the plan was for trade initiatives, Secretary Ross had little to offer in terms of real steps to pursue bilateral deals, let alone multilateral pacts with which this administration has put to the side. And in fact, Secretary Ross talked about the Indo-Pacific strategy as a way to somehow cut trade deficits, as if that was an underlying goal rather than the strategic and economic vision that Secretary Pompeo had laid out just a few minutes before that. So while I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Shadlow's remarks at lunch about there being bipartisan support for the US taking a much more active role across the Indo-Pacific, it is my view that one of the significant challenges we need to remember is the credibility gap that is created for many of our allies and partners who are curious about the various positions and rhetoric that comes out of US government officials. Let me move on to mechanisms and some specific recommendations, and then I'll close. And there are lots of things that we could talk about here, but I thought I'd focus on three very specific, perhaps too narrow, recommendations. But in the spirit of how the Center for New American Security likes to focus on pragmatic solutions, I thought I'd offer three. First, I think there are ways that the US can effectively engage with partners. And one is actually much more inward-looking for the US, and that is to create an Indo-Pacific development hub modeled very much after the Power Africa model that we did in the last administration. That is an interagency initiative that brings together the key personnel and tools and resources from across various US government departments and agencies to focus in on infrastructure development in the Indo-Pacific. That could take advantage of things like the BUILD Act, which Dr. Shadlow talked about, which really ups the US's game in development finance, but of course would require the kind of people that you need in place in particular positions in the government to make happen. Second, I would really ramp up the concept of an Indo-Pacific economic corridor. You know, there's a lot of mention during this conference about the term Indo-Pacific. It was mentioned that Prime Minister Abe coined it, Prime Minister Modi gave rise to it, President Trump, of course, through the national security strategy, has really endorsed this concept. Given that whenever there's a successful term, I think there are many parents. I also want to note, even under President Obama's term, we use the concept of an Indo-Pacific economic corridor. And I think this is a concept that really seeks to create better connectivity measures within South Asia and between South Asia and East Asia. It leverages what is already the most important ingredient for economic growth and connectivity, which is the people, the 2 billion people that are entrepreneurial and ambitious across this region. But the other ingredients that you need are hardware and software. You need infrastructure hardware like roads and rail and ports and power lines to keep goods and people and services moving across borders. And then you need the software like the new regulatory frameworks and capable institutions and network governments and businesses. I think this is where some of the 113 million that Secretary Pompeo mentioned could be put to good use. And then finally, because I know I'm running out of time, the last recommendation I'll have which I don't think got enough discussion today, is really facilitating private sector engagement across the region. Different countries have different approaches to helping their private sectors, and Asia we all know that Asia will be the growth engine of the world in coming decades, but that doesn't happen on autopilot. It requires a robust and thriving private sector where people and goods and services and capital can move freely. And government can play a useful role in encouraging this and creating an enabling environment for that to occur. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Anand. And the next speaker, Professor Tamura, please having a 15-minute speech, please.
Thank you. My presentation should be much less than that, I guess. Thank you very much, Chairman. My name is Aki Tamura, the professor of National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. The abbreviation of this, the name of the institute is GRIPS, Japan. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation to the sponsor and the organizer of this symposium for having me as a part of the panelists. I feel quite honored to be here. Actually, I don't have any background on strategy or national security. I'm just a trade lawyer from Japan. So my statement and the view to be laid out in my statement is going to be a reflection of my unique background as a trade lawyer from Japan. Since this panel is about economic networking challenges and the mechanism to realize the open, the free Indo-Pacific region, I would like to mention the personal view as a trade lawyer, how to realize that. In order to realize a free and open Indo-Pacific region in the economic term, of course, what we must have is rule-based trading order. Of course, this recipe is not only applicable to this region, but also everywhere. In order to realize free and open region or free and open globe, what we must have is rule-based trading order. The reason why is because we need to have stability, we need to have predictability, and also we need to have transparency. Reason why we have these ingredients is because we need to give abundant breathing room to actual actor of global economic activity, which are private sectors. Private actors are true players of economic activities. It's not the government. Private sector is a actual player. In order to give enough breathing room to these players, we have to have the stabilized, transparent, and predictable trading order. So in order to achieve that, we need to create certain level of so-called arm's length distance between the government and market. Unless we have this breathing room and unless we have enough level of arm's length distance between market and the public sector, it's very difficult to secure economic prosperity. From this standpoint, at this moment, one of the most worrisome event in economic term, which is the trade war between the United States and China, this is quite worrisome. And actually, from this standpoint, the China-US trade war is not US versus China. It's not necessarily. It's actually government versus market, or we may be able to say sovereign state versus economy. So it's not necessarily the US versus China. Therefore, the rest of us, including Japan, many middle powers, have to make effort together with private stakeholders to at least, reduce the negative impact of excessive intrusion to economy by these two largest power. We have to persuade both of them to try to at least either stop or either try to lessen the negative impact of this excessive intrusion to the market. Of course, I personally have so many points to agree with the United States argument on, including China's overcapacity issue or technology transfer issue. However, in order to secure rule-based trade system in Indo-Pacific region, I think both US and China make further effort. Japan, together with other partners such as Australia, produced a trade agreement, so-called CPTPP. I wonder whether the United States is eventually coming back to authorize this trade agreement. I mean, authorize means that what I want to say is that we need authority to underpin the trading order. Therefore, I just use the term authorize. We really need authority underpinning trade agreement or trade regime. Otherwise, trade agreement is going to be just a paper. Japan and the other partner agreed on CPTPP, but we are, of course, willing to see the US to come back to TPP for the sake of secured, free, and open region, the Indo-Pacific region in economic term. However, at this moment, it's unclear on whether the US is coming back or not. Of course, I don't mean that the US already lost the interest in being committed to this region in economic term. US is willing, has been, and willing to continue to serve other, provide other public goods, such as infrastructure cooperation and energy cooperation, and so on. This is quite realistic in light of the current political climate. However, I'm personally convinced that in order to realize rule-based economic system, what we need is rather legal order. Because, of course, infrastructure cooperation is quite important, but it's to serve rather materialistic interest. But what we need for construction of rule-based system is rather normativity. Normativity is different from materialistic interest. We need both, norm and materials. After World War II, of course, we have been establishing the rule-based trading order, but we heavily rely on the authority provided by the United States. Therefore, if we lose the authority provided by the United States, what can we do to continue to underpin the global trading order or regional trading order? Only rest of us have to do that. How can we, middle power, can do that? These are really big challenges. Normally, order is to be sustained by the authority provided by the big power. Only middle power can do that. Of course, we have some experience in the history. For instance, when we look back the medieval period, I don't know whether there is any person who knows about law called Lex Metricalina Mercatoria, which is in English merchant law. Merchant law in the medieval era was authorized by merchant without any top-down authority. Therefore, maybe middle power could be able to build up our own authority, even though there is no commitment by the large power. But this is, of course, the second best solution. But interestingly, nowadays, I observed that there is interesting phenomena that the trading community is trying to get the additional authority from non-trade agendas. Nowadays, one of the most important topic in the global setting is not trade issue, but sustainability issues. Many people started to talk about 2030 Sustainable Development Goal, SDGs, means that we may be able to seek for some additional authority from the kind of the strengthening that marriage relationship with non-trade issues such as sustainability. When we look at the talk of the town in Geneva, for instance, everybody talks about how to connect the trade agenda with the sustainability agendas. Therefore, maybe in order to regain the additional authority for trading order, we could be able to more proactively to engage in our dialogue, not only within the trading community, but also with social agenda as well. Already we saw the very interesting phenomena in European Union. European Union, as you may know, under the Lisbon treaties, already they took out of the silos segregated amongst the three pillars, so-called the common commercial policy and the common security policy, and also the judicial cooperation, so that even trade policy have to be carried out in the larger context. It has to always bear in mind that the EU development policy and the sustainability policy. CCPPP and other modern, relatively new trading agreement also have a sustainability ingredient already. CPTPP has a labor chapter, very strong labor chapter and very strong environmental chapter, and also CSR related articles are already prescribed in CPTPP. Therefore, we already see the sign of marriage, a marriage between trade and the sustainability agenda, so that we will be able to regain some additional authority. Of course, this is the only second solution. We're still willing to see the US to come back, not only in the terms of the infrastructure cooperation, but also CPTPP or whatever trade law, because law is quite important. So I stop here, but since the trading system is at bay in the troubling water, so everybody have to squeeze out our wisdom to fix the currently troubling trading system. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tamura, for your very interesting presentation. And also, I appreciate your saving minute. Thank you very much. Next, Christy, please, and please, 15-minute speech.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and it is a great honor for me to be here to speak about the Indo-Pacific. I was put in the session on economic networking, so my point here is to present an economic perspective by providing a conceptual framework to convince you that Taiwan can play an important role in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as in the Indo-Pacific strategy. We heard about the Indo-Pacific strategy in the morning, and the U.S. provide the Indo-Pacific economic vision end of July. And this vision focuses in a number of industries, which include energy, healthcare, financial services, high-quality infrastructure, digital economy, and also it encourages private sector's participation. As mentioned by previous panelists, that private sector's participation will be very, very important in ensuring the Indo-Pacific strategy can work. And also, Japan released last year its vision document of the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, the AAGO. The document aims at enhancing capacity and skills in the region and promoting quality infrastructure, and also promotes development and cooperation projects with countries in this region, in particular with India, and also people-to-people partnership. And in this different concept of free and open Indo-Pacific region, and India and also Australia also play a very important role. Taiwan is not now as a member of the Indo-Pacific strategy. However, I would like to point to you that Taiwan can play a key role in this strategy by bringing or extending manufacturing cluster or value chains to the region, and also help nurture startups, innovation, and also entrepreneurship in this region. And so I'll show you the trend of Taiwan's outbound investment. Taiwan's investment in China show a downward trend since 2010. This shows you the Taiwan's investment in the past 27 years. And this is our investment to the world. And this green line indicates our investment to China. And you see that in the past years, these two lines always go hand in hand, which means they show a parallel pattern. When we invest more in the world, we invest more in China. When we invest more in China, we invest more in the world. However, the trend show a divergence since 2010. And you see from here that our investment in China starting from 2010 continuously show a downward trend. It has been declining in the past 7 years. And we believe that our investment this year and also for the next 2 years may continue to decline. And despite of this declining trend of our investment in China, our investment in the world, for example, in 2015 and 2016, reached a record high, which means that Taiwanese companies are now investing more in other parts of China, including Southeast Asia, South Asia, in particular, United States, and other developed countries. So by showing you this trend, I believe that Taiwan is now diversifying its investment activity and also its business presence. Some of this goes to the important Indo-Pacific region. This trend can further be explained by a number of recent surveys. I'll show you this survey by TIMA. TIMA stands for Electrical and Electronic Manufacturing Association. The TIMA is 电电工会. This association, the membership of this association covers more than 40% of Taiwan's total GDP. And in its 2017 survey, it sends a number of very important messages. The first is Taiwanese companies in China continue to feel pessimistic about the outlook of Chinese economy and continue to feel pessimistic about Chinese investment climate. And more Taiwanese companies in China are now adopting an inward-looking strategy. In other words, Taiwanese companies now in China look more about the domestic market, and they are currently more attracted by China because of its huge market potentials instead of its providing a base for export-oriented industry. And more companies are now look to other countries for further investment. This, in particular, indicates their interest in Southeast Asia and also their interest in India, and also the US has come to become a more attractive destination since last year. And these results coincide with a number of other surveys, including the survey by our Ministry of Economic Affairs last year. And this MOEA survey shows that compare with previous year's survey and also compare with Taiwan companies in other regions, Taiwan companies now in China are suffering more from less favorable investment environments and thinning profit margin, and also severe local competition and unpredictable policy interference. This table shows you a number of very important questionnaires response. Compare with the survey in 2011. In 2017, more companies in China are facing commercial disputes or investment disputes. And also more companies in 2016 are facing a less profitability or negative profitability. And when asked whether they will continue to expand their investment in China, in 2011, more than 50% of respondents said yes. However, last year, only around 32% of respondents are considering to further invest in China. So this is the first point. This is the first point about our outbound investment, which is now taking some changes. The second point I would like to address is about the global value chain. I believe that the Indo-Pacific strategy should aim to establish self-reliant value chains or self-reliant manufacturing industries in the region, and help countries in this region to reduce their dependence on China, including Chinese market, Chinese imports, and also Chinese finance, which is granted under the Belt and Road Initiative, which nowadays that we talk more and more about the debt trap under the Belt and Road Initiative. So I show you the value chain of the iPhone, the smartphones, where Taiwan, US, Japan, Korea are playing a very important role. While you see from this smiling curve here that China is only taking the responsibility of assembling the smartphone, while in Taiwan's case, we are a very important supplier of a number of very important items and technology, which include the cameras and also other parts. So this smartphone industry is now happening in other parts of the world. This is the map of India. We see in the past 2 years that in India, we see an emerging smartphone clusters in India, in different states. And Taiwan is playing a very important role in these smartphone clusters in different states. So we have Foxconn over there, we have Inventec, we have Compal, and also we have Wistron. And almost all of Taiwan's largest smartphone manufacturers and the world's leading contract manufacturers from Taiwan are now investing in India. So this is, according to the media and TV in India, you see that India is now welcoming the smartphone made and assembled in India instead of importing from China. And this is Wistron, a Taiwanese company, which is now helping iPhone, the APAC, to produce the iPhone sets in India. And now the stores in India, Indian people can now buy the iPhone assembled in India. So this is another point I would like to address, which is about a high quality infrastructure and people-centric community. This map shows you that in the next 10 years, 35 cities in Southeast Asia countries will have a population exceeding 1 million. And the urbanization is now speeding up in different parts in Southeast Asia. And more smart cities, green cities are now being developed. And for Taiwan's case, for example, in June this year, the Intelligent Community Forum, the ICF, named the world's top 7 intelligent communities. And 3 of them are from Taiwan, and 1 is Jiayi, Tainan, and also Taoyuan. If you, the foreign, our guests, have not been to 3 of these cities, I encourage you to visit them if you have time. And 4 cities are from other more developed countries, which include Finland, Canada, and also Australia. So this shows you that Taiwan has a strength to contribute to quality infrastructure as well as the smart community and the smart city project. So here are the conclusions and also the way forward. And our point is the Indo-Pacific strategy can realize building a free and open Indo-Pacific region when countries in the region can establish their self-reliant manufacturing industry, in particular critical industries, which include electronics, telecommunications, healthcare, and medical equipment. And Taiwan, as I explained to you earlier, that Taiwan is hosting extensive manufacturing networks in China and also Southeast Asia. And Taiwan is playing a very important role in global value chain of a number of very important industry nowadays. Taiwan is also recognized as a champion of smart city and also ICT technologies. And Taiwanese companies are interested in taking part in America's Indo-Pacific economic vision and Japan's Asia-Africa growth corridor. And these 2 documents and also further plans by US and by Japan have been heatedly discussed by our business communities in Taiwan. And therefore, here comes my suggestions. Taiwan can work with US and Japan to seek more policy synergy of its New Southbound policy with free and open Indo-Pacific region, because our New Southbound policy includes the countries under both Japan's FOIP as well as US Indo-Pacific region. And we have strength and also business presence in Southeast Asian countries and also India. We are now getting more and more presence in other South Asian countries, including Sri Lanka and also Bangladesh. And therefore, if we can work with Japan, US, India, and even Australia, we believe we can work together and help realizing a more self-reliant, free and open Indo-Pacific region. So this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Christy, for giving us very interesting charts, very concrete figures, and very interesting concept. Thank you very much. The next 2 discussants, Mr. Haba Lemanu and also Ms. Rennie Mullen. I'd like you to have 7 or 8 minute comment and including questions. And I appreciate it if you make clear whom you question to in these speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me as part of this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity, also in terms of widening the participation so that we have voices from India and Australia here today. I think that adds a lot to the debate. My observations and questions revolve around 4 main points. The first is, I think there's just a qualitative observation of where we stand in terms of geostrategic tensions and globalization. We live in a very unprecedented era, and there's been a lot of comparison that US-China relations are headed in the same way as Soviet US relations during the Cold War. I think that the big difference there is that there was never this degree of economic integration and interdependence during the Cold War. So the economy, the global economy, is entirely different, differently structured, differently wired, far more cross-border, far more interdependent than it once was. So when we talk about geoeconomics, I think there's a real danger. We need to manage these tensions very carefully, and we have to accept also that globalization provides some degree of ballast, some degree of stability that hedges against the reassertion of rivalry between the great powers. To squander that may actually make things worse for us. So we do have to be very, very careful on that front. So that brings me to my first point, which is really, I think, a point of tension in terms of the US Indo-Pacific strategy and its trade war with China and others. Because I agree with some of the panelists here, I think the trade war with China is broader than that. I think a trade war with China essentially means a trade war with Asia, given how integrated and enmeshed the Chinese economy is into the global economy. So it strikes me as an obvious point of contradiction with the idea that we see the Indo-Pacific strategy as an extension of globalization and deeper integration. There is also the problem of the potential balkanization of supply chains in the region. If we think that somehow we ought to seek to decouple China from the global economy, firstly, I think on practical grounds, that will be very difficult to achieve. It's so large as it stands. China is not going away. It does about $2.5 trillion of trade with the Indo-Pacific, which is 70% more than the US does with the Indo-Pacific. I don't think that fact is going to change. So we have to consider that, but we also have to consider that it may actually end up reinforcing China's strengths. If you speak to Chinese economists, they seem very self-assured that a decoupling with the United States would be all right because they could fall back on the BRI countries with whom they do about $800 billion of exports every year as opposed to the $500 billion of exports they do with the US. And unlike the trade relationship with the US, which is largely stagnant in terms of its growth, the BRI country exports that it does is growing at double-digit rates every year. So we do have to be careful about what I'm terming the balkanization of the global economy because it may end up working in China's favor and be rather counterproductive for the US and other major economies. That brings me, to a second point, and it's also one about a comparison with differences between now and the Cold War. In the Cold War, we had the concept known as mutually assured destruction, and it was something that applied to the nuclear balance of power between the Soviet Union and the United States and other nuclear powers. I think now we really have a situation as well on top of that as known as mutually assured economic destruction. There are we're speaking of such large economies here that to in some way seek to sever that trade relationship between the two largest economies in the world would be counterproductive. It would hit hardest countries that have a far greater trade to GDP ratio than either China or the US, because both those economies, by virtue of their size, have very significant domestic economies to fall back on, meaning the costs of a potential trade war, if it were to escalate beyond what it is already, would hit the countries that are much smaller, proportionately much more dependent on the global economy. Economies like Vietnam, like Thailand, like Malaysia, and like Singapore. Singapore, I think 318%, its trade to GDP ratio is 318%, as compared with 37% for China. Another thing to keep in mind is that the story of China as a sort of trade-dependent country is sort of outdated. It's something that pre-exists the global, the financial crisis of 2008. there was a point where China would have been much more vulnerable to trade pressures. At the moment, though, it's done a very concerted effort to rebalance its economy, whereby even though it does just as much trade or more trade with the rest of the world, as a proportion of its GDP, it's only 37% now, which is only 10% higher than the US and far lower than any other country. So keep in mind that I think a trade war is not going to affect China as heavily as we might hope, and it will disproportionately affect smaller economies as collateral damage. Point one. Secondly, I think when we talk about economic networking, we really think, I mean, we should really start thinking in terms of resilience. And this is where I agree with some of the panelists. We need to start thinking about where to invest, not just how much we invest. Mike Pompeo at the Indo-Pacific Business Summit in DC last month mentioned that the US has more stock investments in the Indo-Pacific than China. And that is true. Over many decades, the US still has accumulated more stock investment in the region at large. But it's not just how much money you invest in the region, it's where you choose to invest in the region. So China, whilst it spends less on its total investments, it's actually something like 16% of total FDI globally is from China, as opposed to 20% from the US. China manages to do more with less money. It invests in smaller countries, where it has a higher risk appetite, and perhaps it also has a greater degree of geostrategic ambition. And its average share of inward foreign investment from China for most countries in the Indo-Pacific region is higher than it is for the US. So for the US, it chooses to invest as much in Australia as it does in all ASEAN countries combined. And that's sort of an Australian problem as well. We have invested 3 times more in New Zealand, our nearest neighbor, than we have in all 10 ASEAN countries combined. So it's about the diversification of investment. It's about the diversification of trade, not simply in absolute numbers, but also as a relative share, particularly in smaller economies that are the most vulnerable in terms of their dependency on their largest trade and investment partners. That's what we should be thinking about, because ultimately it comes down to choice. You will never be able to exorcise China from the global economy, but you can give smaller players more choice, and that will give them greater degrees of autonomy and resilience, which is what you need ultimately if you're going to seek to manage China economically in this geoeconomic sense, in this geoeconomic game that we're playing. Third point is really about the fact that I think we've overhyped the China rising story. It's an enormous economy, but there are reasons to start doubting, or there are reasons to assume that we've reached peak BRI. There's increasing realization and wariness among countries in the BRI region that debt trap diplomacy is something detrimental to their long-term interests. We've seen, for example, in Myanmar, the renegotiation of a key project, the Kyokpyu Special Economic Zone and Deep Sea Port, which China was originally offering to build for $7.3 billion, and just in the last 2 months alone, the Burmese authorities have renegotiated that to $1.3 billion because they're worried that they might fall in the same debt trap as Sri Lanka did when it comes to the Hambantota port. Similarly, in the Pacific, we spoke about the Pacific Islands a bit earlier in previous sessions. I think the point to make there is that we've just released a research project that shows that Australia is still the largest aid player, the largest donor in the region for Pacific Island states, and that there is a big difference between Chinese commitments and Chinese spending. So Australia has spent $7.7 billion in the Pacific Island states between 2006 and 2016. By contrast, China has actually only spent $1.8 billion. So again, this difference between rhetoric and action is something we need to take very seriously when it comes to China. So what do we do? I think there are obvious lessons to be learned from Taiwan, and particularly from the new southbound policy. It's about trying in some way to encourage business. After all, these are private sector agents. They're not at the disposal of the state in the way that China's SOE might be. to invest in markets where they traditionally have not gone into. And that will require greater coordination in terms of public-private sector initiatives. It will require the creation of third-party platforms where policy coordination, incentives, so preferential interest rates for loans, and also commercial viability. These issues get discussed between public and private sector agents, because at the moment our big Achilles heel in terms of free market societies is that we cannot rally the private sector in the way that China has been able to rally. Now that's not largely a good thing in terms of our institutional resilience, but there are things that we can do in some way to seek to rectify that. So it's about diversifying our trade relationships, realizing it's not just about absolute sums of money, but also where that money goes to, and seeking really to prioritize the resilience of smaller countries in relation to China. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Habe. My understanding is that you provided your comment, not including question, but anyway, someone could respond to you later, okay? Ms. Lamy, please.
Oops, there we go. I realize we're running short on time, so I'll try and go over this quickly, but I just had a couple slides that I would like to bring into the discussion. But first of all, let me thank you, say thank you to the Prospect Foundation. It's my first time in Taiwan, and it's really, you know, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you also to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and to the Center for New American Security. I've been doing a little bit of research on Chinese investments as well as Indian investments in the Indo-Pacific, and we've just seen the 5th anniversary of the BRI. In these past years, China has signed or updated FTAs with 13 countries, has 82 overseas economic zones in countries that are part of the BRI, most of them in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think what becomes clear, and here you have a map of ports where China has been investing in the broad sort of Indo-Pacific. What becomes clear here is, and I realize we've had to, the organizers had to divide us into panels on security, on economics, but you know, increasingly the economic challenges are inseparable from strategic issues. When you look at the ports that the Chinese are building, many of them, if not most of them, dual use, from Mozambique to Djibouti, Oman to Tanzania, Gwadar Port, where they have a 40-year lease agreement, where the country's debt is over 50% of its GDP, Hambantota, where there's a 99-year lease agreement, Cambodia, where they have a 99-year lease agreement, in Malaysia, 2 different ports, 30 and 99 years lease under renegotiation now, Brunei, 60-year lease agreement, Australia, 99-year lease agreement, Palau, recently Chinese investors secured 99-year lease agreements for hotel projects, but you get the picture. Most of these, in fact, are not only just ports, but they have land leases or special economic zones attached to them. This brings me to the point of the Chinese debt trap leading to debt for equity swaps mentioned by the earlier discussant, Hervé Lemoyeux. The Sri Lankan case of a country being cornered with so much debt that it then ended up making sovereignty concessions, I think is an important one to look at, because there are several others lining up in that same situation. Pakistan is basically drowning in debt. I've been asking Pakistani officials, you know, what are they going to do? And the answer I keep on getting is, we're too big to fail. China is our longtime partner and will not let us fail. The high debt of the Chinese, that the Malaysians had to the Chinese, drove the recent political outcome of the Malaysian elections. I just came here last night from New Zealand, and there the talk was, of course, on the Pacific Islands. Tonga now owes China 150 million. You might say that's not much, but it's 1/3 of Tonga's annual GDP. Overall, Pacific Island countries, 11 of them owe China $1.3 billion, and many of them are in financial difficulties. And the question, of course, is, how will this be resolved? So I've also been working on putting together a database of Indian foreign aid and engagement, and I've started to map out some areas where India is starting to look at ports and giving assistance to port building. But clearly what you can see here, and what you also know, is that India does not have the deep pockets, the manpower, or the ability to deliver quickly and match the kind of engagement that China has in the Indo-Pacific. The Sri Lankan example, I was recently there at a conference where Sri Lanka was trying to attract investments beyond China, and frankly, the only country that was well represented there was Japan. India sent a retired admiral. There was no Australians other than the ambassador who made a quick appearance. But my point there is, where is the multilateral thinking? Where is the concrete multilateral engagement? So I think it's important then to think about what's happening not only in the South China Sea, but really in the Indo-Pacific. How are we actually going to promote the free and open Indo-Pacific? I have the benefit of being an academic and not having been in government, so I can call a spade a spade. And I think, as an American, I have to say and echo what Manpreet Singh Anand was saying earlier. There's a real gap between the talk of an open and free multilateral Indo-Pacific coming from the US administration and the actual actions in terms of engagement. I think we are seeing a real lack of thinking, and the question then is, what should we do given this engagement? So I guess my question to Manpreet is, you mentioned several suggestions for what to, how one could go forward given US, I would call it disengagement, despite the rhetoric. How can we push the multilateral? And really, how can we call the US out to really actually engage, to do what it's saying that it wants in this region? My question to Akiko Tamura is, you mentioned the institutional structure, but what institutional structure is there to deal with this issue that you mentioned of sort of a government versus a market-based system, that the trade war is about this, right? So what kind of institutional structure is there, or would you envision to deal with these kind of issues? Because I think we have to start talking more concrete terms. And then my question for Christy Su is, you mentioned that Taiwan is willing to be part of this new thinking on policy synergy. But I think we have to think a little bit broader beyond, frankly, the US, given the current policy, and Japan. And I think it's important to include India and Australia, as you mentioned, but why not go beyond? There are many other willing actors, and I think it's time to start thinking more broadly. I think one has to build a coalition which goes beyond these, includes Indonesia, includes Australia, but maybe also includes the European powers. It's clear from the morning session and the panel presenters that there are, in fact, no multilateral arrangements that can deal with the economic as well as strategic challenges brought up by an increasingly hegemonic China. I think the challenge is to think proactively regarding multilateral institutions. And I guess my question again for each presenter is, what specific multilateral institutions would you envision to deal with the problems that you've brought up? Because it's time to think out of the box. Thank you.
Thank you, Lani. First, Tamura-san, can you respond to her? And also, I'd like, Mr. Manpreet Singh Anand to further explain the U.S., Pacific policy, taking into account the Harvey's comment. And different from this comment, I would like to add a question to you. That is, the Professor Tamura mentioned the need of authority to maintain the international economic, framework or order, and also for the past, the United States played the role as a maintainer of the order. Do you think, not your opinion, but do you expect the United States, coming back to the TPP, or setting aside the coming back to the TPP? Do you think the United States has an intention to keep or maintain the international, economic order as hegemon in a good meaning? So first, Professor Tamura-san.
Thank you very much. The question from the Professor Mullen was directly addressed to my presentation. Therefore, I tried to answer your question. I guess maybe partly because my presentation was a little bit misleading, or maybe I was not clear enough about what I wanted to say. First of all, I didn't mean to say that the CPTPP or any other trade agreement should be like joined, or the trade agreement should be agreed by private sectors. I didn't mean to say so. Obviously, trade agreement is an institutional framework consisting of government. Therefore, at least what I envisage is as a kind of a trading system in the Indo-Pacific region or anywhere is to be mainly formed or joined by the sovereign states. So therefore, I'm quite clear about how that trading, the institutional arrangement should be. It's a government, the G2G framework, including CPTPP. Nevertheless, still that I find that there is some role to be played by the private sector. First of all, in order for the trade agreement to have a certain level of authority to be accepted by the regional citizens, we have to find the source of authority to sustain that trading order. So definitely private sector, including the business community, is a primary source of authority to underpin that trading order. Without any welcoming sign from the business sector, the trading order is not going to sustain. So therefore, I really think that as a source of authority to trade order, private sector is very important. Not only business, but also the more we include the social agenda in the context of a trade agreement, civil society's role also is quite important as a source of authority. There is another role to be played by private sector, which is that actually setting aside that the trade agreement, there are tons of so-called soft law arrangement. Soft law arrangement is not necessarily the G2G framework. there are lots of private-based the soft law frameworks. Therefore, it's not about the trade agreement, but maybe we'll be able to produce many kind of trade-related framework driven by private sector. So I wanted to say these two things as a function of private sector. But mainly, of course, obviously, the trading the institution is to be run by public sector.
Thank you, Tamura-san. And Mr. Manpreet Singh Anand, please.
Well, thank you. So a couple of responses. First, on the question about the U.S. Being able to maintain a rules-based trade order or economic order, and what's the conversation in the U.S. right now that might cause many people to have a little bit of concern or at least pause about the U.S. willing to play that role. I would say, hopeful that what's happening today in the U.S. political realm is an aberration for what I think will be looked at years from now as kind of a blip on an otherwise, I think, positive trajectory towards promoting free trade and a rules-based economic order. I'm hopeful because I think we have a vibrant and increasingly powerful private sector that understands this, that understands the role that the U.S. can play and will assert itself to try to course correct in any way in which we may fall off course currently. I'm also hopeful because I think, as I mentioned during my opening remarks, the national security professionals in our government understand that our military power is very much based on our own economic security, and that economic security has been based on a different world order since World War II, one in which the U.S. has not just built but led, and that it requires that type of approach going forward. With the specific question about coming back to TPP, I don't know is the honest answer. Again, I could be hopeful, but it's too far in the future, given the current political leadership, to determine whether or not that's possible, what shape the CPTPP would be in at that point, and whether the political winds in the United States would allow for that, especially given the dysfunction that we have in the U.S. Congress at the moment. On the question about multilateralism that Ronnie mentioned, and the question about whether or not the current administration would adopt or would join any type of multilateral effort, I think that's difficult under the current administration. I think there's been a concerted effort by the President Trump, to display his displeasure with multilateral trade regimes and multilateralism in general. So I think it doesn't give a lot of room for U.S. policy to be based on engaging in multilateral arrangements. Having said that, I think there are some areas where there could be decent progress. I would note that Secretary Pompeo's remarks also included supporting multilateral regimes like the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which I don't know that a previous Secretary of State has even mentioned IORA in the past, and so I thought that was useful. I think there are ways in which we can work within existing multilateral organizations like the Asia Pacific Economic Members Cooperation Forum, APEC, would be hopeful that that would broaden to include members like India. I think we've had tremendous success in trilateral. There's been a lot of talk in this conference about the Quad, but we've actually had tremendous success in a trilateral mechanism between the US, India, and Japan, and looking at all sorts of issues, including infrastructure throughout the region. So I think there are groupings that can be leveraged and used towards productive outcomes, I don't think it will get the political high-level attention, but frankly, in this current political environment, that may be a good thing.
Thank you, Mr. Anand. And we have two questions from floor. So any question? You first, and two questions. One more, but anyway, you have a question.
Thank you, Akema-san. Quick questions for Manpreet, Hervé, and Rani. Manpreet, how do you reconcile sometimes the economic objectives as you laid it out, and I appreciate the Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor and other ideas, with sometimes the political objectives that the United States has? And just to give a very specific example, when you have a coup in Thailand, when you have a Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, when you have a flawed election in Bangladesh, and the US responds in a manner that wants to advance its political objectives or governance objectives, it seems to be coming up against what could be a long-term economic policy, and these are key critical countries that will be required. So how do you reconcile that? Hervé, is there a bit of a contradiction between the point you made about there being a backlash to BRI, we're at peak BRI, and the kind of faith that you seem to place at the beginning in China's ability to withstand shocks to its system and fall back on BRI countries? How do you, there seem to me to be a little bit of a contradiction in those two elements. And finally, to Rani, why the focus on, why do we need multilateral solutions? In the sense that there are, there are existing mechanisms, the Asian Development Bank, but that would require Japan taking a step backwards and giving space to other countries in the leadership of ADB. India has set up a public-private fund, an NIIF, but is having trouble, for reasons that largely have to do with India, but in general is having trouble getting investors from other countries. So there are these mechanisms, there are these vessels, but for a variety of reasons having to do with national sovereignty or national interests, sometimes parochial ones, they seem to be, so why should we just focus on multilateral efforts? Why not coordinate, as Manpreet said, why not coordinate our various bilateral efforts?
Thank you. The first question to Mr. Anand, and the second question is Christy, or you? No? To whom? Oh, sorry, Abe. Okay. Thanks. You saw her, so I misunderstood.
Thanks, Ruva, for your question. The short answer is it's really, really hard to reconcile these issues. The longer answer is what ends up happening when you have these events, the coup d'etat in Thailand, the refugee crisis in Myanmar, Bangladesh, or flawed elections, is that you try to construct policies that encourage the authorities or the government in place to move along a path that, along principles that we would propose, while not penalizing those people who would otherwise be the beneficiaries of stronger economic engagement or development programs. When it comes to things like the Rohingya crisis, by no means would the United States try to limit our funding or support to deal with what is absolutely a humanitarian crisis, and we wouldn't use that as leverage per se, in trying to encourage the government to do something differently. And so I think there's a bifurcation there. I do think, however, that if we feel like those principles are not truly upheld by the authorities in power, then there are tools we can use that sometimes are more targeted, sometimes are blunter, to try to encourage the leadership to take different actions. You can think of sanctions, and we've done that in the past. I was in the US Congress on the Foreign Affairs Committee when Tom Lantos spearheaded the JADE Act against Myanmar. And so you try to use a variety of tools for different purposes, but it's not always easy, and it does, especially in the public, come out to be sometimes a muddled picture. But it's something that we work hard at trying to thread the needle when we're in government.
Thank you. Habe, please.
Thanks. I'm glad you pointed that out. So firstly, on the just a very quick point on Myanmar and governance. I mean, actually, I've spoken with some of the economic advisors in the government, and they would have really wanted Western countries to have placed bids for the Kyokpyu deep sea port. Unfortunately, no country in the West wanted to do that because it's in the Rakhine state, which is exactly where the violence is being perpetrated against the Rohingya. But on the other hand, I mean, this is where it's a trade-off. Had it been a Western company, there would have been more chances of actually incorporating that as part of a sort of corporate social responsibility program that reached out to the Rohingya, which is something that Kofi Annan had recommended, but the Chinese company in question isn't doing at the moment. But briefly now, moving to the BRI, I think yes, it's a little bit of a contradiction. I think there's two things, there are 2 points I want to make. One is that both China's overall dependency on trade as a percent of its GDP is declining and has declined since 2008, which means it is more resilient towards global economic headwinds than it was in 2008. Secondly, its dependency on the US as its primary trade partner has also declined to historic lows at 16%. Because it is now doing so much more with its immediate region, by which I sort of said the BRI region, broad, and that's sort of a regional designation as opposed to the initiative. When it comes to the initiative, I think we have seen peak BRI initiative, simply because BRI as a sort of tool of leverage, of extricating concessions from your neighbors using debt trap diplomacy is something that the region as a whole seems to be catching on to, and there seems to be more hesitance to engage in that form of interaction with both SOEs and the Chinese government. So, you know, basically China's not going anywhere, its economic presence is huge, but I also think we need to be somewhat hopeful that I think we've reached a degree of wariness in the region now, which means that naivete has declined, and perhaps then we need to offer more options in terms of trying to boost the resilience of smaller countries and increase the number of economic partners they have.
Thank you, Habe. Thank you. So the last question, any question? No question. Thank you. So could you please join my applauding 3 panelists and 2 discussants. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Akiyama, and thank you all our panelists. We will go into a very short break, so you to answer the call of Mother Nature and have a refreshment of coffee to keep you awake. We will reconvene at 4:20.